Welcome back to A-Level Geography Explained. In this video, we're covering EQ1 of the Global Development and Human Rights topic. What is human development and why do levels vary from place to place? We'll explore how development is defined, what shapes human health and life expectancy, and the role of governments and international organizations. Let's get started. For many decades, development was measured predominantly through economic indicators, with gross domestic product, GDP, per capita acting as a shorthand for a country's prosperity. This economic view assumes that as nations produce more goods and services, individuals will become wealthier, healthier, and better educated. However, this linear logic has been increasingly questioned. Rising income does not guarantee improvements in well-being, equality, or environmental sustainability. The Happy Planet Index is one alternative that measures sustainable well-being by combining life expectancy, experienced well-being, and ecological footprint. It reveals, for example, that some lower-income countries, like Costa Rica, score highly due to environmental sustainability and strong social support systems, while wealthier nations with high resource use may score poorly. Critically, many traditional models also reflect Western capitalist values, which may not align with all societies. Bolivia offers a clear example of an alternative approach. Since 2006, the government has promoted the concept of Viva Bien, a development philosophy rooted in indigenous Andean worldviews. It emphasizes harmony with nature, collective well-being, and cultural identity, rather than purely material growth. This model challenges mainstream neoliberal economics and places social and environmental justice at the center. In other contexts, development is shaped by religious and cultural values. For instance, in Saudi Arabia, development frameworks are informed by Islamic law, with social welfare and economic justice deeply embedded in the religious system. This shows that there is no universal template for defining or achieving development. Many modern development theorists argue for broader, more multidimensional definitions of development. The Human Development Index, HDI, developed by the United Nations Development Programme, is one of the most widely used composite indicators. It combines life expectancy, education levels, and income to give a more rounded picture of human progress. However, even this index can mask inequalities within countries. Swedish academic Hans Rosling played a major role in reshaping global understanding of development by using statistics to demonstrate that many low- and middle-income countries have made huge gains in health and education, even without high levels of income. For example, Bangladesh has achieved significant reductions in child mortality and maternal deaths despite having limited economic resources. This supports the idea that economic growth is not the ultimate goal, but rather a means to achieving human flourishing. Access to basic needs such as nutritious food, clean water, healthcare, sanitation, and education are central to true development. So too are freedoms, gender equality, and the ability to live without fear of violence or discrimination. The idea of sustainable development, meeting the needs of the present without compromising future generations, further broadens the debate. It combines economic, social, and environmental goals, recognizing that over-reliance on natural resource exploitation may undermine long-term well-being, particularly in vulnerable communities. Education is a critical foundation of human development and one of the most powerful tools for reducing poverty, promoting gender equality, and fostering inclusive growth. Economically, a more educated population increases national productivity, drives innovation, and enhances competitiveness in a globalized economy. But education also plays a deeper societal role. It equips people with knowledge of their rights, helps them participate in democratic processes, and can challenge discriminatory norms. For example, increased access to secondary education for girls has been strongly linked with delayed marriage, lower fertility rates, and better maternal health outcomes. Despite international efforts to promote universal education, significant challenges remain. In parts of sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, many children, particularly girls, are still excluded from education due to poverty, gender bias, armed conflict, or the need to work. In regions like Afghanistan, political regimes have reversed progress by restricting girls' education altogether. Furthermore, access does not always equate to quality. In many countries, schools are overcrowded, under-resourced, and lack trained teachers. According to UNESCO, over half of children globally are not achieving minimum proficiency in reading and mathematics, even after several years of schooling. This highlights the need not just for educational access, but for investment in high-quality learning environments. Health is a key component of human development, and in low- and middle-income countries, it is closely tied to environmental and infrastructural factors. Access to clean water and safe sanitation is vital for preventing infectious diseases, yet these basic services remain unavailable to hundreds of millions of people. In sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, around 40% of the population lacks access to basic sanitation, contributing to widespread transmission of waterborne illnesses like cholera, diarrhea, and typhoid. Such diseases are especially lethal for children under 5, who account for a high proportion of preventable deaths. The World Health Organization has emphasized that many of these fatalities could be avoided with relatively simple interventions, such as better hygiene education and improved sanitation infrastructure. Malnutrition is another major issue. It weakens the immune system, increasing vulnerability to diseases and reducing the effectiveness of vaccines. In countries like Yemen, Ethiopia, and South Sudan, conflict and climate change have exacerbated food insecurity, leading to high rates of stunting and wasting in children. Maternal and infant health are also serious concerns. In places with limited healthcare access, childbirth remains dangerous, and maternal mortality rates are unacceptably high. Cultural practices and lack of medical professionals further compound these problems. In high-income countries, non-communicable diseases such as cardiovascular disease, cancer, and type 2 diabetes are the leading causes of death. These are often linked to lifestyle factors including unhealthy diets, lack of physical activity, smoking, and excessive alcohol consumption. While healthcare systems are more advanced in these countries, inequalities in access and outcomes persist. In the United States, for example, millions remain uninsured or underinsured, and healthcare costs are a leading cause of debt. Racial and ethnic minorities often experience poorer health outcomes due to structural discrimination and unequal access to services. In contrast, countries like Sweden and Norway operate universal healthcare systems with an emphasis on prevention and early intervention. However, even these systems are not immune to inequality. In the United Kingdom, the 2020 Marmot Review highlighted widening health disparities, with the most deprived communities experiencing rising mortality rates and shorter life expectancies. Mental health is also gaining recognition as a major public health challenge. Rates of depression, anxiety, and suicide have been rising, particularly among young people. This signals that health is not merely about physical survival, but also about emotional, psychological, and social well-being. Averages can conceal profound differences in health outcomes within countries. Wealthier urban populations may enjoy advanced healthcare services, while rural or marginalized groups remain underserved. In Brazil, residents of São Paulo's wealthier districts have life expectancies comparable to those in Europe, while those in remote Amazonian communities face much lower lifespans due to poor nutrition and inadequate healthcare access. Similarly, in Australia, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples face significantly worse health outcomes than the non-Indigenous population, including higher rates of chronic disease, substance abuse, and infant mortality. In the United Kingdom, there is a marked north-south divide in health. For example, a man in Kensington and Chelsea might expect to live 10 years longer than a man in Blackpool. These differences are strongly correlated with social deprivation, housing quality, employment status, and access to education and green spaces. These patterns reflect structural inequalities that cannot be addressed through healthcare alone. They require broader social policies aimed at improving the social determinants of health, including income, education, housing, and employment. National governments are central to shaping development outcomes through their policy choices, governance structures, and resource allocation. countries that invest heavily in social infrastructure, such as healthcare, education, and housing, tend to achieve better human development outcomes. Scandinavian countries, for example, have long-standing welfare systems that prioritize social equality, public health, and family support. These policies help reduce poverty, increase life expectancy, and promote gender equity. In contrast, authoritarian regimes or those affected by corruption may divert resources away from public services, undermining development despite economic growth. In Zimbabwe, for instance, economic mismanagement and political instability have resulted in underinvestment in education and health, leading to deteriorating living standards. The key point is that development is not only about having resources, it's about how those resources are used. International governmental organizations such as the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, IMF, and World Trade Organization, WTO, have played major roles in shaping global development policy. Since the 1980s, these institutions have promoted structural adjustment programs, especially in Africa and Latin America, which encouraged free market reforms, privatization, and reduced government spending. While intended to promote efficiency and attract investment, these policies often resulted in cuts to education and healthcare budgets, worsening poverty and inequality in some cases. Critics argue that they prioritized economic liberalization over social development and were driven more by donor interests than recipient needs. More recently, however, these organizations have begun to embrace broader development agendas. The World Bank now funds projects on health, education, and environmental protection, and has acknowledged the importance of addressing gender inequality and climate resilience. Nevertheless, concerns remain over the power dynamics between lenders and borrowers, with some critics arguing that global institutions still exert undue influence over national policymaking. In 2015, the United Nations launched the Sustainable Development Goals, a global framework of 17 interconnected targets designed to be achieved by 2030. They aim to end poverty, reduce inequality, promote gender equality, ensure access to education and healthcare, and address environmental challenges like climate change and biodiversity loss. Unlike their predecessors, the Millennium Development Goals, the SDGs apply universally to rich and poor countries alike and place a strong emphasis on sustainability and human rights. However, progress is uneven. While significant advances have been made in some areas, such as expanding access to electricity and reducing child mortality in parts of Asia, other goals, including clean water access, climate action, and peace and justice, remain far behind, especially in sub-Saharan Africa and conflict zones. The COVID-19 pandemic has also set back progress on many fronts, exposing deep structural inequalities and reversing years of gains in health, education, and poverty reduction. As the 2030 deadline approaches, global cooperation and political will are more crucial than ever. If you found this helpful, subscribe for more A-level geography content, and check out the next EQ2 video on the causes and consequences of global inequalities. Thanks for watching. Welcome back to A-level Geography Explained. In this video, we are exploring EQ2 of the health, intervention, and human rights topic, why do human rights vary from place to place? In this inquiry question, we examine how human rights have been enshrined in international law, why their protection differs across countries, and how inequality still exists within borders. From global declarations to national corruption and social divides, this is a core part of understanding global development today. Let's begin with international frameworks. In 1948, following the devastation of the Second World War, the United Nations General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, widely seen as the foundational global document for modern human rights. It sets out a broad range of civil, political, social, and economic rights that should apply to all people, including the right to life, liberty, education, and freedom of expression. Although highly influential, the UDHR is a statement of intent rather than a binding legal document. This means that while it forms a moral and political guide, it does not have the legal power to enforce compliance. Its principles have influenced numerous national constitutions and regional treaties, and it is often used by international organizations and foreign governments to justify interventions, particularly humanitarian ones. However, this can be contentious. Critics argue that human rights language is sometimes instrumentalized for political or strategic purposes. For example, NATO's intervention in Libya in 2011 was partially justified on the basis of protecting human rights, but the aftermath raised concerns about motives and consequences. Additionally, not all countries have fully embraced the UDHR. Some argue that it reflects a Western, liberal model of individual rights, which may clash with collectivist or religious values in other regions. This has led to differing interpretations of what constitutes a right and who gets to define it. The European Convention on Human Rights was established in 1950 by the Council of Europe. It was designed to protect citizens from abuses of power and prevent the rise of totalitarian regimes like those witnessed during the Second World War. Unlike the UDHR, the European Convention is a legally binding treaty. Member states agree to uphold its provisions and allow individuals to appeal to the European Court of Human Rights if they believe their rights have been violated. In the United Kingdom, the Convention was incorporated into domestic law through the Human Rights Act of 1998. This means British courts are obliged to interpret laws in a way that is compatible with the Convention. If that is not possible, cases can still be taken to Strasbourg. However, the ECHR has become increasingly controversial in the UK. Some politicians argue it undermines the authority of Parliament and national courts, particularly in areas such as immigration, national security, and deportation cases. This has reignited debates about the balance between universal rights and national sovereignty. The Geneva Conventions, particularly the Four Treaties of 1949 and their additional protocols, form the basis of international humanitarian law. They are concerned with the treatment of individuals during armed conflict, protecting civilians, prisoners of war, and the wounded. These conventions are endorsed by nearly every nation on Earth, with 196 countries as signatories. Despite near-universal support, enforcement is highly inconsistent. Although the Geneva Conventions provide a framework for prosecuting war crimes, very few individuals are ever brought to trial. Institutions such as the International Criminal Court exist to address these crimes, but they face serious obstacles. Political complications, lack of cooperation, and selective enforcement mean that many perpetrators evade justice. Moreover, despite international prohibitions, over 150 countries have been reported to engage in torture, either directly or indirectly. The legal framework is therefore strong in theory but often weak in practice, especially when national interests or power politics are involved. Countries differ in how they interpret and prioritize human rights. Some nations consistently raise human rights issues in international diplomacy and use them as a core part of their foreign policy. These include states like Norway, Sweden, and the Netherlands, which often tie development aid or trade relationships to human rights performance. In contrast, other countries argue that the immediate priority should be economic development, with civil and political rights to follow later. This argument is often made by emerging powers like China or Vietnam, where governments stress economic stability, poverty reduction, and national unity. They may restrict freedom of expression or control the media, justifying these actions as necessary for maintaining order. China's model of authoritarian capitalism, for instance, has achieved rapid growth, lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty, and built substantial infrastructure. However, this has come at the cost of significant political repression, including mass surveillance and tight control over dissent. From this perspective, economic development and human rights are not always mutually reinforcing, and some states make strategic decisions about which to prioritize. The structure of a country's political system plays a central role in determining how rights are protected. In democratic states, such as Germany or New Zealand, regular elections, independent judiciaries, and free media help uphold the rule of law and protect freedoms. Citizens typically enjoy rights such as assembly, protest, and freedom of speech, and they can hold their leaders accountable. In contrast, authoritarian regimes concentrate power in the hands of a single party or individual. In such systems, rights may be granted selectively or withheld altogether. In North Korea, for instance, citizens have almost no freedom of movement or expression. The state monitors activity, controls the media, and punishes dissent harshly. Russia, while not fully authoritarian, has seen growing restrictions on civil society and the media, particularly since the early 2000s. Elections still occur, but they are often criticized for lacking transparency and competitiveness. The contrast between democratic and authoritarian systems helps explain stark differences in how human rights are both defined and experienced by citizens. Corruption undermines the rule of law and poses a direct threat to the protection of human rights. In countries where corruption is widespread, laws may be selectively enforced, officials may demand bribes, and powerful individuals may operate above the law. This weakens citizens' ability to seek justice and erodes trust in institutions. The Index of Corruption, published annually by Transparency International, provides a comparative measure of public sector integrity. Countries like Denmark and Finland consistently score well, reflecting strong democratic institutions, press freedom, and transparent governance. By contrast, nations such as Somalia, Syria, and Venezuela score poorly, with widespread reports of bribery, extortion, and suppression of political opponents. In such contexts, human rights become fragile or even meaningless, as legal protections are rendered ineffective. Corruption can allow security forces to act with impunity, journalists to be silenced, and legal systems to serve the interests of elites. As a result, the mere presence of legal rights does not guarantee their actual protection. Even within a single country, human rights are not always experienced equally. In many post-colonial nations, historical hierarchies have shaped patterns of privilege and exclusion. Certain ethnic groups, often those who held power during colonial rule or emerged dominant after independence, continue to benefit from preferential access to land, education, and political representation. In Nigeria, for example, ethnic tensions between the Hausa Fulani, Yoruba, and Igbo groups have led to uneven development and outbreaks of violence. In India, despite formal legal equality, caste-based discrimination continues to restrict opportunities for Dalit communities, especially in rural areas. Gender inequalities are also significant. In parts of the Middle East and South Asia, laws still limit women's rights in areas such as divorce, inheritance, and dress. In some societies, girls are less likely to attend school, more likely to experience forced marriage, and often excluded from political participation. These patterns are deeply embedded and require long-term societal and legal change to address. Differences in human rights within countries often show up in indicators of social development. Marginalized communities frequently experience poorer health outcomes, lower life expectancy, and limited access to quality education. In Canada, the Indigenous First Nations population has long faced systemic discrimination, including in healthcare and education systems. Many First Nations communities have limited access to clean water, high suicide rates, and underfunded schools, despite Canada's overall high ranking on the Human Development Index. In Brazil, stark inequalities exist between white and Afro-Brazilian populations. Black Brazilians are more likely to live in favelas, face police violence, and experience worse educational and employment outcomes. These disparities reflect not only socio-economic inequalities but also the unequal enforcement of rights. Legal guarantees mean little without effective implementation. Despite persistent inequality, there have been powerful movements demanding justice and equal rights. In Australia, Aboriginal Australians have fought for land rights, official recognition, and cultural protection. Progress has included legal land titles and formal apologies from the government, though challenges remain. In Bolivia, indigenous groups have gained increased political power, particularly under former President Evo Morales, whose government recognized indigenous languages and traditions in national institutions. In Afghanistan, the rights of women and girls have been heavily contested. During the early 2000s, international efforts supported increased school enrollment and political representation for women. However, the return of the Taliban in 2021 has led to sweeping rollbacks in education, employment, and personal freedoms. These examples show that progress in human rights is not guaranteed. It depends on a combination of legal reform, political will, and public activism, and it varies widely from place to place. If this helped you understand EQ2 more clearly, be sure to subscribe to the channel and check out the next video, where we explore geopolitical interventions and their impact on development and human rights. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one. Welcome to A-Level Geography Explained. In today's video, we're diving into Inquiry Question 3, how are human rights used as arguments for political and military intervention? This question explores how human rights violations are often cited as reasons for political or military action in various parts of the world. Let's begin. Human rights violations can be a catalyst for various types of geopolitical intervention. These interventions can take the form of development aid, military aid, trade embargoes, or even direct military action. The methods used to address human rights issues often depend on the political context and the severity of the violations involved. Development aid is one of the most common interventions in the name of human rights. Countries or international organizations provide financial resources to help address human rights abuses by improving education, healthcare, and governance in struggling nations. This form of intervention is seen as a way to reduce poverty and inequality, factors that often correlate with human rights violations. Trade embargoes and economic sanctions are another form of geopolitical intervention, where countries or international bodies like the United Nations, UN, restrict trade with nations that engage in human rights abuses. The idea behind these measures is to pressure the targeted government to change its policies by causing economic hardship. While sanctions can be effective in drawing attention to human rights issues, their success in achieving tangible improvements can be limited. Military aid and even military interventions are often promoted in situations where human rights abuses are deemed to be at a level where diplomacy and economic measures are no longer sufficient. This form of intervention can include providing weapons, training for military personnel, or direct combat operations aimed at removing oppressive regimes or preventing atrocities such as genocide. The role of international governmental organizations, national governments, and non-governmental organizations, NGOs, in promoting these interventions cannot be overstated. NGOs like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch are often the first to raise awareness about human rights abuses, putting pressure on governments to act. International governmental organizations, like the European Union, and national governments, particularly those from Western countries, often use their influence in international forums to push for human rights-based interventions. Despite these actions, there is rarely full consensus on the legitimacy of such interventions. Countries with differing political ideologies or strategic interests often have conflicting views on whether human rights violations warrant intervention. For example, Russia and China frequently oppose Western-led interventions in the name of human rights, citing respect for national sovereignty and non-interference in domestic affairs as key principles. Western governments, particularly those in Europe and North America, often justify their interventions in foreign countries with human rights arguments. These interventions are frequently framed as a way to protect vulnerable populations from governments accused of committing atrocities, such as genocide, ethnic cleansing, or political repression. For example, NATO's intervention in Kosovo in 1999 was justified as a means of preventing human rights abuses by the Serbian government against ethnic Albanians. The intervention, led by the United States, was framed as a humanitarian effort, although it was also tied to strategic interests in the Balkans. However, these interventions often raise questions about national sovereignty and political legitimacy. The concept of sovereignty is fundamental in international law, and interventions that bypass the approval of the United Nations Security Council, UNSC, or disregard a nation's right to self-determination can be seen as undermining this principle. Critics argue that when powerful countries intervene in the name of human rights, they often do so selectively, based on their political and economic interests rather than genuine humanitarian concerns. For instance, while Western governments have frequently condemned human rights violations in countries like Sudan, Syria, and North Korea, their responses to these violations have varied significantly, sometimes based on geopolitical interests. The lack of consistency can create the impression that human rights concerns are being used as a tool to pursue broader foreign policy objectives, rather than as the sole motivation for intervention. Another key aspect of human rights-based interventions is development aid. This is a widely used tool to support countries in need of assistance, particularly those where human rights violations are prevalent. The aim of development aid is often to improve the living conditions of the population, which in turn can help address the root causes of human rights abuses such as poverty, lack of education, and inequality. Supporters argue that development aid can provide the resources necessary to improve human rights by funding projects aimed at improving education, healthcare, and access to basic needs like food and water. For example, in Haiti, post-earthquake aid was instrumental in addressing the immediate human rights crisis by providing emergency relief and funding long-term rebuilding projects. However, critics argue that development aid can sometimes have negative consequences. It can create dependency, with recipient countries becoming reliant on external assistance rather than developing their own capacity to tackle human rights issues. Furthermore, the distribution of aid is often influenced by the interests of donor countries, leading to concerns that aid may be tied to political or economic conditions that prioritize the donor's strategic interests rather than the recipient country's human rights needs. Some critics also highlight the environmental and cultural impacts of development aid. Large-scale infrastructure projects funded by aid agencies or transnational corporations, TNCs, may displace local populations or disrupt traditional ways of life. For example, oil extraction in the Niger Delta has led to significant environmental damage, including pollution and land degradation, and has had serious implications for the human rights of the local population. Similarly, projects like the Keystone XL pipeline in the United States have sparked debates over the rights of indigenous peoples and the environmental consequences of economic development. In addition to development aid, military aid is another form of intervention that is often justified in terms of human rights. This can take the form of arms sales, military training, or direct military action. Military aid is often provided to regimes or groups that are engaged in conflicts where human rights abuses are occurring. This creates a paradox, however, as some of the recipients of military aid may themselves have questionable human rights records. For example, Saudi Arabia has been a recipient of military aid from the United States, despite its poor record on human rights, particularly regarding freedom of speech, gender equality, and the treatment of migrant workers. The justification for this aid is often tied to strategic geopolitical interests, such as maintaining stability in the Middle East and securing energy resources. Similarly, direct military interventions, such as those seen in Afghanistan and Iraq, are often justified by intervening powers as efforts to promote human rights. For instance, the 2001 invasion of Afghanistan was framed as an effort to remove the Taliban from power, protect human rights, and prevent terrorism. The removal of the Taliban allowed for some progress in areas like women's education and healthcare. However, critics argue that the intervention ultimately created long-term instability, human rights abuses continued, and the geopolitical goals of the intervention, such as establishing a pro-Western government and controlling the region's natural resources, were not always aligned with human rights. One of the most significant contradictions in military interventions framed as human rights protection is the use of torture by states involved in these interventions. Several countries involved in the war on terror, particularly the United States, have been accused of engaging in torture as part of their counterterrorism efforts. Notably, Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq became infamous for the abuse of detainees by U.S. military personnel, despite the U.S. having signed the United Nations Convention Against Torture. These actions highlight a fundamental tension. while military interventions are often justified as efforts to promote human rights and protect civilians, the use of torture and other human rights violations by intervening forces undermines the credibility of these interventions. The use of torture violates international human rights laws and conventions, including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which explicitly prohibits torture and cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. The controversy surrounding torture during the Iraq War is an example of how interventions can often be compromised by the actions of the intervening forces. This contradiction serves as a reminder that the pursuit of human rights through military means can be ethically fraught and inconsistent with the very values being promoted. Thank you for watching. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more videos covering A-level geography. Goodbye. Welcome back to A-level Geography Explained. In today's video, we're looking at the final inquiry question of the human rights and interventions topic: what are the outcomes of geopolitical interventions in terms of human development and human rights? We'll explore how the success of interventions is measured, how development aid and military action play a role, and why outcomes can vary so widely between places and over time. Let's begin. Success in geopolitical interventions is not easily defined. It can be measured using a wide range of variables, often depending on who is judging. Key indicators include improvements in health outcomes, rising life expectancy, higher levels of education, and more gender equality. Other metrics include increased political freedom, freedom of speech, effective refugee management, and rising gross domestic product per capita. For example, a successful intervention may be one where child mortality rates fall, literacy increases, and women gain better access to political and economic life. Alternatively, a country might be judged as successful if it simply returns to a stable economy and starts growing again, even if broader human rights have not improved. Some governments and international organizations, particularly those in Western democracies, define success through the development of democratic institutions. They often see political freedoms, such as a free press, fair elections, and independent courts, as essential to long-term development and stability. For these actors, human rights and democracy are intertwined. On the other hand, some countries prioritize economic growth as the main indicator of success. For example, China has invested heavily in Africa, often focusing on infrastructure and trade without insisting on democratic reforms. This approach often improves economic conditions but may pay less attention to political freedoms or broader human well-being. Development aid is one of the most common forms of geopolitical intervention, but its effectiveness varies significantly. In some cases, aid has led to notable improvements in human development, while in others it has had limited or even negative effects. Botswana is often cited as a relative success story. Since gaining independence in 1966, it has used international aid to improve health systems and education, achieving high levels of governance and economic stability. Similarly, during the 2014 to 2016 Ebola outbreak in West Africa, coordinated aid helped prevent a regional health crisis from becoming a global catastrophe. Aid improved health infrastructure and led to better coordination among local and international actors. In contrast, Haiti presents a much more troubling example. Despite receiving large volumes of international aid, particularly after the 2010 earthquake, progress has been limited. Much of the aid failed to reach the poorest communities, local institutions were undermined, and corruption and mismanagement have limited long-term recovery. Development aid also has varied effects on economic inequality. In some states, aid has reduced income gaps and improved life expectancy, education, and healthcare. In others, aid has reinforced elite control or created dependency, worsening inequality. Where aid is well targeted, such as investments in rural healthcare or girls' education, it can significantly improve human development indicators. However, where aid is poorly managed, it may flow disproportionately to cities or be captured by elites, failing to benefit those most in need. Superpowers and regional powers often use aid as an extension of their foreign policy. Rather than focusing purely on humanitarian outcomes, aid is sometimes used to secure political influence or strategic alliances. The United States and China, for example, both tie aid to broader objectives. The US has offered aid in return for military cooperation or United Nations support. China often offers no-strings-attached loans and infrastructure projects as part of its Belt and Road Initiative, but in return, recipient states often support Chinese positions in international forums or allow Chinese firms access to key resources. In these cases, the success of aid may be judged by the donor in terms of political return, rather than improvements in human development. Military interventions, both direct and indirect, often aim to achieve quick political or humanitarian outcomes, but they carry significant risks. Costs include the loss of national sovereignty, destruction of infrastructure, long-term instability, and sometimes new human rights violations. The 2003 invasion of Iraq by US-led forces was justified on the grounds of removing a dictatorship and promoting democracy. While Saddam Hussein's regime was overthrown, the long-term consequences have been severe. The country experienced sectarian violence, instability, and the rise of extremist groups like Islamic State. Human rights abuses, including torture at Abu Ghraib prison by US forces, undermined the credibility of the intervention. Similarly, Afghanistan saw initial improvements in women's rights and education after the 2001 invasion, but those gains were reversed when Western forces withdrew in 2021 and the Taliban regained control. In contrast, non-military interventions often have stronger and more sustainable impacts on human development and human rights. Organizations such as UN Women work to improve gender equality globally, supporting legal reforms and education initiatives. UNICEF plays a vital role in improving child health and access to education, especially in post-conflict regions. These interventions are typically more collaborative and less controversial than military action, focusing on long-term capacity building rather than regime change. At times, the global community fails to intervene at all, and this can have devastating consequences. The 1994 Rwandan genocide is a clear example. Despite clear signs of escalating violence, the international community did not act in time, leading to the deaths of around 800,000 people in just 100 days. Inaction can also delay progress in other areas, including environmental protection and gender equality. When interventions fail to materialize due to political hesitancy or a lack of international consensus, long-term human development is often hindered. One of the key challenges in assessing geopolitical interventions is balancing short-term achievements against long-term outcomes. In Sierra Leone, British military intervention in the early 2000s helped to end a brutal civil war. In the years since, democratic elections have been held, and there has been a focus on rebuilding governance and justice systems. However, economic development remains slow, and youth unemployment is high. In contrast, Libya saw a Western-led intervention in 2011 to prevent government attacks on civilians. While this helped remove the Gaddafi regime, Libya has since fragmented into rival governments and armed groups, with ongoing instability and human rights abuses. Ultimately, the most successful interventions are those that help states to achieve long-term, sustainable development. This includes building inclusive institutions, protecting minority rights, fostering education, and promoting fair economic systems. Interventions that rely heavily on military force or are driven by the strategic interests of donor states often fall short in delivering lasting improvements to human rights or development. By contrast, locally led initiatives, supported by external partners but rooted in community needs, often produce more durable progress. Thank you for watching. If you found this helpful, be sure to like the video and subscribe to A-Level Geography Explained for more clear, concise breakdowns of the key topics you need to know.